Hi there, everybody, and welcome to this week's Art of Procurement podcast. Here we are on episode 246. Now, before I begin, I wanted to let you know that our next AOP live session is this coming Thursday. If you're listening to the show on the day that it's published, it'll be this Thursday, April the 4th. And I'll be joined by Chris Conneru. Chris is the head of Infosys' sourcing and procurement practice, and we're going to be discussing why technology is just the beginning of a digital transformation. So you can sign up to the webinar by going to artofprocurement.com/AOP live. That's artofprocurement.com/AOP live. And if you recall, this webinar series is actually, we ditched the slides. It's all about a conversation. It's about making a session that is very much like a podcast, but rather than this being a one-way conversation where you're listening in, you really get the chance to participate and ask the guests, in this case, Chris, lots of questions. We want it to be as engaging as it possibly can. So again, if you want to sign up for this month's, it's artofprocurement.com/AOP live. And I'm joined today by Andy Atkins. Andy is a professional commercial contract manager, and he has a decade of experience negotiating and drafting complex financial, IT, and telecom agreements. Andy's got a really broad industry experience, and he's now the VP of Third-Party Risk and Performance Management at UMB Bank, based in Kansas City, Missouri. So Andy recently authored an article for IACCM's Contracting Excellence Journal. It was titled The FinTech 5, Mitigate Risk by Focusing on 5 Clauses. And so the article caught the attention of the AOP team, and so we invited him on the podcast to discuss the fintech industry and his tips on performing due diligence on startups and emerging technology firms. Now, before we begin, and due to the nature of Andy's role in a highly regulated industry, his company actually asked us to include a disclaimer at the beginning of the pod. We're happy to do that, of course, because it actually then enables us to share his experiences with listeners on the podcast. So here goes with the disclaimer. Today's discussion does not condone nor condemn the investment, business relationship, acquisition, or trading of any equity directly related to a financial technology company or entity. This podcast discussion is strictly for educational purposes and is not for legal or financial advice. The opinions represented here do not necessarily reflect those of Andy's current or previous employers, and Andy is speaking today on his own behalf without further representation. Okay, with the disclaimer said, let's go straight into the show. My first question for Andy is the one that I always ask. I ask if he found procurement or if procurement found him.
Definitely procurement found me. It wasn't something that, I was thinking about, in grade school or anything that, I didn't even know that was
right.
A career path even through college. It's kind of one of those things that stumbled upon it. Really, the reality of it was that kind of during the 2008 economic downturn, I had been laid off but rehired by the same company because I knew a manager within that area. And I didn't really know what they did, but I knew that they kind of did something with, supplier management and procurement. But I knew the manager really well. And once I got in, I was hooked. I really, really enjoyed it. And it's one of those things for me that I fell in love with it mainly because I really like the negotiation portion of it. I like the fact that you can impact the bottom line for a company and you can show that, substantial effort that you put through it and what it shows back to the company,
mm-hmm.
In terms of, supplier relationships, cost savings, benefits, the things are just, enormous benefits to the company. And so, from there, I knew that this is what I wanted to do. And my ultimate goal is to become a chief procurement officer.
Yeah. And, within a regulated industry as well. So there's a little bit, I would say the approach to procurement is a little bit different, having been in regulated industries as well myself, than in a non-regulated industry. And it's interesting, we were talking before we recorded about some of the benefits actually that brings. We often think of being in a regulated industry as being a negative because, there's often more red tape, but actually it can instill better practices.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I work for a financial institution that also does banking as well too. So we have all sorts of government oversight from the OCC, FDIC, SEC, any of the government acronyms you can think of
Yeah.
there. So it's definitely the alphabet soup as far as that's concerned. But I do look at that as a positive. I think a lot of times people can see that in a negative light because you're forced to do things that maybe non-regulated companies will do. But it's my opinion, and I've seen empirical evidence of this, that it provides benefits that other companies won't do because they either won't put the budget money for that, or they just don't see this as a priority. Things in terms of SLA monitoring, or if you think about the fact that you're doing additional due diligence on the front end, which means that you're more secure with the suppliers or the vendors that you're working with. It helps also develop those relationships because you're working closer with these vendors. You're using more of a leveraged approach because the sheer amount of vendors that you would work with, if you're going to do that amount of due diligence, would certainly strain resources across the entire company. So, I look at it as a positive, and it really draws out a lot of benefits that other companies, even if they took a streamlined approach from that, would really benefit from. And I think, it's one of those things where I'm often interested in even seeing how that model would work out in some of these particular areas. And I think, we're starting to see that even in some non-regulated areas, maybe potentially social media or some other areas that are looking into, taking a standpoint of, maybe a more, risk-based approach when it comes to integrating with their suppliers.
Yeah, I would always encourage anyone who's listening, who's interested in how they can think about risk and building in place, I would say more scalable risk management practices, is to just go and search for third-party risk management regulations. And it can be from the FFIEC, the SEC, as you mentioned before, the FDIC. They're all much the same in terms of what they require. Take a look at that and see what you can adapt in your own business, because you have the opportunity in a non-regulated environment to not have to just apply the exact letter of the law. But there's some really good practices in there, especially when you think about at the high level, how do you even determine which suppliers you should be considering to do additional risk due diligence on? It doesn't actually take that much to build some questions out, to just ask yourself every time you're sourcing something that will help you mitigate some of the bigger risks that you may face later down the line.
Yeah, and the Office of Comptroller Currency, or the OCC, has done a really good job. So if you Google OCC Bulletin 2013-2019 or 29, so 2013-29, they actually go through what it's like to set up a third-party risk management system. Obviously, this is applicable to the banking area, but a lot of this stuff could be extrapolated to non-regulated entities. And this is stuff that's just on the OCC website, so it's not, it's not anything that's proprietary or anything. It's just best practices, and they put out this for banks as far as responding to what this would look like for developing a risk management program and what they expect to see when they would come in and take an audit of a bank. And a lot of these, I think, are best practices, but I do think some of them are things that get lost in the shuffle at other companies. And I think, just taking a look at this would provide a great framework for that.
Yeah, when I jumped into financial services, prior to that being in pharmaceutical, consumer products, in the automotive business, I'd never really been aware. I knew of the regulatory requirements, but not in depth what they were. And so I went into them with a perception of them being onerous. And it all depends on the execution, to be honest with you. Yep. The organization I was in, we did execute them in a way which just was probably not the most effective, but just the nature of our situation at the time meant that we had to. But there's just things that you can take as a non-regulated industry to put into place, based on what fits with your culture.
Yep, absolutely. Totally agree with that.
And so today I wanted to talk a little bit about fintech. I know it's an area that you're passionate about and that you've written about. But before I kind of go down that route, I just love for your perspective, what exactly is fintech?
So fintech is it's what they would call a portmanteau, which is kind of the combination of two words. I always think of like the celebrities when they combine the names, like the Jennifer Aniston and Ben Affleck when they refer to it as Bennifer. So the financial technology is what that stands for when they refer to fintech. And it is really a large area. I think the connotation of it, when most people hear that term, they think of startups. So if you think of, kind of a new startup that's going to bring, a disruptive type technology to the financial areas that are, in some cases, heavily regulated. In some cases, they haven't been because this technology didn't exist. But the reality of it is that, fintech could include large companies that have been doing this for a while for technologies that do a lot of business to business type related technologies. On the consumer side, there's a lot of peer-to-peer payment networks that exist that are really popular on a lot of people will use those on their apps on their phones these days. And the term fintech definitely it denotes that connotation of a startup, but it definitely encompasses a lot more than that. It's very unique in the type of area because it's sort of just now kind of coming into its own in a lot of areas. And some of the financial technologies that are existing are integrating with current banks that currently exist as far as using maybe some of the background rails and systems that they use. And then some of them are on their own and they just have new technologies that, allow you to purchase stocks or, trade, stocks or various instruments, financial instruments, strictly through applications that exist either on your phone or your desktop. And so because of that particular area, it's, forging new ground, and there hasn't, we talk about regulations in the financial areas, and those have been established over hundreds of years, and some of them have ramped up over, various years for, obvious reasons. But, when we talk about, financial technology, that is really in its infancy in some areas in regards to what the regulatory landscape looks like, certainly in the United States, but definitely in other parts of the world as well.
Mm-hmm. And would a provider of a fintech service, are they aiming that service at a financial institution, or can any company be buying what is broadly falls under the umbrella of fintech? It's not something that's just limited to a financial institution.
Absolutely not. I think that's where the majority of the attention comes from, is because that, in some ways impacts consumers or from a business perspective. But absolutely, there's a lot of areas in which financial technologies or fintechs will start integrating with just your average non-banking areas. When you think about business-to-business transactions or payments to suppliers, things that integrate that particular areas, there's going to be, and there already is, some specific fintechs that focus in those business-to-business transactions and payments in areas. So as far as working with them in terms of, licensing and setting up systems, for payments, various things like that, there's absolutely going to be, and already is, players in that area that will impact areas outside of just the banking or the financial industry.
And would you say that most of those would be related to the treasury function, or am I being a little bit too, is my view a bit too small?
I think for this discussion, I think yes, that most of those are probably going to be in the treasury area. There's potential for some other stuff I could see maybe impacting the area, but for sake, I think, of this conversation, I think definitely what would be most prudent, for non-financial companies would be the treasury perspective.
And that would be, as you mentioned before, something that could perhaps aid in supplier payments. So I know as a service provider, we've worked with clients who have providers in place, where, for example, you can get accelerated payment terms. Would a company like that be someone you would consider fintech, or is that a more traditional financial services?
That could be a fintech, and certainly, this isn't a stated definition that is, just black or white. There is a lot of gray area for that, but that could be what, in this particular area, what would be considered a fintech. But also, I think in terms of maybe not necessarily some larger businesses, but if you think about some smaller commercial businesses that, do business to business payments or do, regular type banking transactions, there are some financial technologies that will integrate either between those two or, potentially move to try to, be that player in that particular space. So there's financial technologies that exist, currently that are in those particular areas, generally in that kind of field, but they could be aiding in payments, they could be aiding in deposits or accounts payables, accounts receivables, those kind of things, designed to integrate the small business into something that's more streamlined, something that we're more accustomed to seeing at larger corporations.
So from a procurement perspective, then, do you find yourself mostly? Is it the business that's identifying a technology that they want to explore and they're coming to you for help in how to do that? Or are you able to go to the business, or should our role be to be able to go to the business and actually share innovation that you're seeing within the fintech space that could actually help develop, drive, improve our business?
And this is a great question, because I think it's both is the answer. I think that in terms of the non-regulated companies that are generally doing procurement, there's going to be a lot of areas in which it would be beneficial to do some homework from the procurement professional. And I'm a big advocate just in any type of sourcing and knowing your customer base and knowing the internal customer base and what it is that they do from a product perspective. I think I heard one of your podcasts, and I apologize, I don't remember who it was, but they had mentioned that they took a specific SEC training, I think, at one point, just to get that, understanding of what their customer does. And I've done some similar stuff too, where I've done some high level engineering courses to understand telephony agreements when I would negotiate, those type of things. So understanding your customer base and their motivations is absolutely critical, but that also provides you the ability to see the landscape from a different perspective, which means that you then can see things and anticipate needs that they may have before they even have them. And that's really where I think procurement professionals draw the most value from and, provide value back to that business beyond just what you would, the normal cost cutting, measures or cost reduction measures. Those are things that you're providing to them that provide that value, that streamline efficiencies and things that bring that value back to it. So I definitely think that should always be a key factor into it. But from that regard, it could be some stuff that, the business would come to you as well too. And so, always understanding and knowing what exists outside of just those particular areas, I think are very important.
Yeah. I love your approach to putting yourself in the shoes of your stakeholders or your customers so you can start to see some of their perspectives. Because I just don't think that that's something that we do enough. And often it's not through, it's not that we deliberately don't do it. It's a time thing because it is an investment in time. But obviously, it's an investment that can pay off handsomely just by finding the time to do it.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think it definitely pays off. Just so obviously from a career perspective, that can pay off. But just from the value that you can provide to the company that you support and what it is that you do on a day-to-day basis. I mean, I do it probably somewhat out of necessity because it's hard for me to negotiate terms with a supplier without understanding what it is that my business is doing and understanding the motivations behind both players. Because if you don't, you're obviously missing out on leverage standpoints. You're missing out on negotiation tactics. You're missing out on, industry, standards, models, practices. And, it really just, I don't feel like you can support your customer base without having that understanding. And I think that's where, I again applaud you for providing this platform, because it provides people those kind of opportunities to see that insight that exists, so that we are truly professionals and that we're not just papering deals, so to speak.
Right. You're just running a process at that point. If there's no other value that you're bringing, then your stakeholders not going to look at you in that way either. They're just going to look at it as a nuisance versus a value contributor.
Exactly. And I think a lot of times, when you talk about rolling out new programs and stuff like that for procurement, if you're rolling out like an RFP process or you're rolling out, any number of, procurement procedures that you would want to roll out, you're going to be seen as an obstacle through those lines of businesses that you support, unless you can provide them the ability that they see value in what it is that you do. And so that's where I think that becomes critical. You definitely earn their trust that way. They understand that you know what their business is. They understand that you know what their needs are, and that you're assisting them and truly, helping them as a partner, as opposed to, just somebody that they have to go to get something that they need.
So where do all the fintech companies hang out? Where's a good, where do you go and do some due diligence to understand what's in the market? Is it, is there the giant fintech conference where you can go and meet everybody, or is it, highly product and category and market specific?
There are some hotspots, at least as far as the geographic location is concerned. Obviously, you anticipate the Silicon Valley companies. Atlanta has a huge hub for financial technology companies. Austin, Texas, of course.
Yeah.
Areas that you would expect in the same geographical location as your technical companies in some regards. But as far as where you would want to do some particular research on it, there is a free service called Lexology, and they provide a lot of insight in terms of due diligence in terms of legal perspectives, and they do an outstanding job. And you can sign up to get an email from them daily as well. In terms of what they provide from the legal landscape. But then, each individual company will have some unique perspective, and so you'll have to do some due diligence on those on an individual basis. Yeah. So there probably won't be that particular area, but I think there are some standard programs that can help you, in terms of, if you're just looking for supplier due diligence information, outside of that, like the International Association of Commercial Contract Managers, or the IACCM, they do a great job with their website and offer, different types of, training and certification and stuff, and some general stuff that you can get without even having to subscribe or be a member. But obviously there are member benefits to that as well.
So I do just for a moment want to talk about startups, and that's, what kind of due diligence do you do? And this is really even perhaps before you engage them. You're not really at the serious point in having a discussion with them yet, but you want to get a flavor for,
right,
is this company even somebody who we think would be appropriate for an organization like ours? There's certain things that you look for when you're at the very early stages of looking into a fintech company.
Yeah, I think you want to do, you obviously want to do some basic due diligence. And so to the extent that they're a startup, they're not likely to be a publicly traded company at this point. Right. So I would highly recommend looking at their financials, assuming that they'll provide it. I think that's a good basis point just to start. When you think about this, just like any tech company, it could be something that takes off, or obviously it could be something that, could be a risk from that particular financial standpoint. And I do just want to point out that sometimes in the procurement world, it comes across that we make everything sound riskier than it is. And it doesn't mean that these can't be good ideas, good investments, or good business opportunities. They absolutely certainly could be. But this is a unique particular area, which I believe requires some different due diligence from that standpoint that you should focus on. So in terms of the startups, I would start with financials. And I think that's going to be the most important to determine, how they are healthy from that perspective and what that's going to look like from a business relationship, going forward. To the extent that you can, I would also see if you can do customer referrals as well. I firmly believe in having some conversations with, other companies that have used, these particular companies. I think those provide some insight that you can glean a lot from in that particular area. And so those would be the areas that I would start. But I would also start doing some investigations too, depending upon what it is that they do. So if they're going to have sensitive employee or customer information, you're going to want to understand what their information security protocols look like, and what, do they have, penetration testing on a yearly basis? Do they, obtain, SOC reports, those kind of things that are going to be unique, that they may or may not have from a startup perspective. And you need to determine, what risk thresholds you're willing to have based on that and the sensitive information they may have.
Yeah, because a lot of time, and I think we'll talk about it in a little while as well when we go into some of the more specific due diligence, but risks are there to be mitigated. So just because they exist doesn't mean that you can't do business. It, as you said, it really depends on your risk threshold, doesn't it? And what you can put in place to try and mitigate it, and whether that's gives you a certain level of comfort, or whether it's just something that can't be overcome, that you just can't do business because it's just too high of a risk. Yeah,
absolutely. And that's rare, and it's a very rare occurrence that would be the case. I think, and I think it's, they're not any riskier, I would say, than any other particular area. They just, I think, need to be looked at in a different light. If you follow the standard due diligence practice, you'll be off to a good start, but there are things that you should understand that are unique to this particular area in the industry that's going to be different than anything else that you've done, because they likely have access to that sensitive customer information. And even if you're not in a regulated industry, that may become regulated information because of what it is that they then obtain. And so it's a very tricky area. And, I referenced earlier that we were kind of in the infancy of the regulatory landscape for a lot of this stuff. And so those laws, I expect, and already have started to evolve a little bit more. I think in this past summer, the OCC has offered charter status to financial technologies, and so that has looked different. And so I think there's things that I refer back to in the article that talk a little bit about, making sure that, you're indemnified in the contract for any kind of violation of applicable laws. And of course, as that landscape grows, it could be difficult to keep up with that, certainly from a non-regulated company perspective, that you're not on top of these regulations. And so being indemnified for that is going to be critical in that particular area. And so those are some things that I think are important when you're doing those due diligence to kind of focus on.
Well, let's talk a little bit more, because you mentioned the article that you wrote. It's the FinTech 5, Mitigating Risk by Focusing on 5 Clauses. And I'm going to put a link to that in the show notes for the episode. And in the article, you talked about 5 different ways that you can help to mitigate risk. I wonder if you could share what those are, where you're really focusing in the contracting process.
Yeah, and certainly I just want to say that, these are definitely not the only areas of focus. If you just have these 5 in your contract, you want to, that's not going to be good enough. But these are the areas that I think have unique focus, and they're not going to be unique terms to anything. I mean, these are going to be terms that exist in probably every other contract that you do, but they're unique to this particular area, and I kind of highlight that in the industry. But the terms that I think I'm talking about, are indemnity. And so specifically, we sort of talked about that a little bit. If you think about it from an intellectual property standpoint, that's one. So a lot of the financial technologies that you could be working with could be new technologies, and if they're working on, certain platforms, you want to make sure that you're indemnified if you're sub-licensing, services from them as well too. Standard stuff that you would have in a software technology agreement, but it's unique in this particular area and something you want to keep an eye on. I highlighted a couple of instances in there where there was some IP infringement issues that had transpired. Not that those are common, because they're not, but those are things that you want to kind of look out for. And the other thing is obviously violation of applicable laws. The other thing, one of the other things I talk about is confidentiality, and that's going to be important, obviously in any agreement, but specifically when we talk about financial technologies and what that looks like when you're talking about financial data and, consumer data, potentially customer data, employee data. Those are things that are unique to this particular area that generally are going to kind of make you look at this in a different perspective, and understanding that you don't have to know everything in every law that exists in that particular area, but knowing that you have those terms in your agreement are going to be important. But also specifically, I might also point out that you want to talk about, destruction of data or whatever legal holds that you would have to have as far as that's concerned. You want to make sure that that information is safeguarded I also talk about internal controls. And what I really mean for this is talking about, we mentioned earlier the Service Organization Control Report, or the SOC, the SOC 2 generally. Outside of the United States, they focus a lot on the ISO 27001, areas that kind of are similar in regards to, ensuring internal controls that exist. I recommend, looking at things like, do they do penetration testing? Will they provide those reports to you? If there's errors and deficiencies that exist in those, reports, what are they doing to mitigate those circumstances? Those kind of things. Those are important in terms of transmitting the customer data that you're working with. And so there's a lot there that goes into that. But one of the other things that we talk about in the article is the limitation of liability. And this is going to be important in every particular area. But, it's going to be critical when you're working with suppliers from this particular area that you, work to have what would be an adequate limitation of liability control there, so they're not limiting any potential damages that may occur in that realm for a breach of contract or a breach of information security, that kind of thing. And then we talk about business terms in this. And what I mean by that is just business continuity. So from the standpoint that you're going to rely on this, if we go back to earlier examples and we're talking about, potentially using this platform in a non-regulated area, and you're using this for business-to-business payments, or you're using this for, some sort of back-end function that you would use for that area, it's going to be critical that they have a good uptime for this. And what do those look like? What does the recovery time objectives look like in those particular contracts? And those are important controls that you want to establish to begin with, because, you theoretically could be, or the business could be moving, some sort of system that would be something that they've relied on and has always worked for a long period of time into technology. And it's going to be critical to ensure that goes off without a hitch. And obviously that leads up to the second business term, which is the implementation portion of this. And that, just like any technology, you want to go off without a hitch. But this is going to be important. So especially if you're talking about payment terms, things like that, you're going to want to make sure that goes off smoothly. And to the extent, like we were talking about earlier, you can do that due diligence and make sure that you've done customer referrals, people that have done implementations previously, so that you can focus on what that looks like. Those are what I would refer to as the FinTech 5, and obviously things that you want to focus on. Those are the 5 things that I think you should put the most emphasis on when negotiating those contracts.
And I would definitely, as I mentioned before, I'll link to the article in the show notes. Would you have a right to audit? So would you expect a right to audit clause with any contracts as well, so that you can actually go in there and make sure that they're doing all the things that they say that they're doing?
I think definitely that's something, if you can add that in there in terms of, some things that you want to do for internal controls, that's great. You want to certainly get things in there, and I would certainly recommend, doing site visits and stuff beforehand as well too. Now, sometimes if we're talking about, smaller businesses that may not have the resources to do that, I would ensure that you put the focus on the SOC report, and then, and those are independently done and presented. And of course, you're going to want to spend some time with the SOC report if you don't have the ability to do some of that due diligence yourself, and any kind of outcome that may come from that. We want to make sure that there's any remediation that's being done by the company. And those are stuff that you should be getting on a yearly basis. But yes, if you can get the audits in there and you have the ability to do it, I absolutely agree.
And so I'm going to go back again to thinking of a lot of the fintech firms being younger organizations, and they're used to moving at a different pace, perhaps, than a heavily regulated financial entity, that has the red tape that you have. How do you balance the two? When the younger company, the startup, they're wanting to move quickly, they're probably iterating very quickly on their product. So they may be even on a version that's, 3 times removed while you're still trying to finish your initial supplier due diligence. How are you balancing those two against each other to make sure you can actually implement some of the technologies?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that you and that's where the due diligence comes in, so specifically, so that you understand whether or not this is a fit for the company that you're going to work with. Because if it is a startup that's working several versions in advance and they're, doing maybe some more agile kind of development where they're dropping code in, on a frequent basis, and you don't have the ability to do regression testing to determine if, that breaks any system in your standpoint, then that's probably not going to be something that's going to work for you. And that may be one of those things where you highlighted, or you may have the ability or flexibility for a smaller business to move on a more agile basis. And that could be the catapult for, that business to kind of move in a quicker regard. I think that there is, the reality of the situation is there's generally a mix of what occurs. I think a lot of what I see is generally a lot of push to market for a lot of these firms, but they also understand that they're working with a system that is regulated and contains sensitive information, and understand that they may move quickly, but the market itself may not. And so there's kind of that ebb and flow that exists between the companies there that they're working with, and so that takes on a unique perspective. So I from what I notice, I think that they generally work fairly well together, and you don't generally get that, but obviously that's why that due diligence becomes so important, is that you're looking at this ahead of time, and as a procurement professional, I do believe it's your responsibility to understand those dynamics of not only the culture of the company that you work for, but also the culture of the company that you're doing business with, and how those two integrate is critical. And we talk a little bit in the article about the implementation for that and what that looks like. And so I think those are great things to highlight.
Now, if this is a hot technology, the likelihood is that the provider has a number of different options of people who they want to sell to or that they can sell to, and they're probably constrained on their ability to sell to everybody who wants something, because of cash flow, because of their internal resources, all the things that go into scaling up a business that takes off quickly. And so you have that, but you also have a regulated environment where they know that there's going to be some things that are the same with every single client or prospect in that market, because you're regulated in the same way. Outside of the regulations, are there things that you can do to, effectively become a customer of choice because it's based on your business process or your approach to dealing with smaller companies? And I'd love to hear if, you've had experience of doing that, so that you can build that relationship outside of and while still maintaining all the regulatory requirements of what may be a slower process.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, there are certain, things that I think that you can do, and this is kind of painting it with a broad brush because, like we said earlier, financial technologies can span the spectrum from very large to very, very much a startup. But I think if you're talking about a startup in general, one of the things that's going to be important, and I think you brushed on that topic, was, cash flow. And I think, that could be an area particularly beneficial to work with that particular company on faster payments. And it may even be in your best interest when you're working on these terms to look at things like, negotiating, a smaller discount for, a faster payment than your standard net 30 or net 60 or whatever that looks like, because cash flow for you may not be the issue, but certainly from a startup that could be the deal breaker, and things that become an issue there. And I think those are some things that could kind of endear you to the company. And I think those are important things to talk about as far as understanding your customer base too. I see a lot of discussions sometimes about where I kind of see procurement painted in the brush of being very much zero sum, where you have to win in order for that to happen, the supplier loses. And I think that's a terrible way of looking at it, because it just it entrenches this mindset, and the reality of the situation is nobody wins in that situation. Right. And you become further apart, and you don't endear yourself to these particular companies, and you don't work with these companies to develop longer term relationships. And that's a sad thing, because you miss out on a lot of innovation that occurs. Yeah. And I have seen, just throughout my career, enormous amount of innovation that was sparked by supplier relationships. And I think those are things that only exist if you've developed and cultivated that relationship to begin with. And so thinking about it from that mindset, that it's not a zero-sum perspective, that there is give and take, there is win-win scenarios that exist, and it's better to have that partnership than, consider them just a vendor that you do business on a day-to-day basis with.
Yeah, and reputation travels fast, doesn't it? So you get known for being on one side or the other of that equation pretty quickly, especially in the startup community, and for people who are working with you in the startup community. So you'll quickly find it not only impacts the relationship with somebody who perhaps you're working with today, but the potential relationship of working with others in the future.
Yeah, and I think, even outside of just financial technologies or startups, I see it just, you think about sales reps that you work with that go to different companies on a fairly frequent basis, and they may be competitors of the company that you were just working with. And so obviously that makes, the word travel quickly, just in the same way that procurement professionals may work at several different companies. It's not unheard of to have sales sales folks work at different companies as well. And so, those are things to keep in mind, that yes, that reputation will travel, and you generally don't want to be branded as somebody that's going to be difficult to work with. You're not likely to get better deals that way. That's for sure.
So, Andy, it's about time to wrap up. One, I want to thank you so much for joining me today. As I come to the close, I just have one final question, and regular listeners will know that I always say this is the easy question. And that is, if people would like to reach out, they've enjoyed the conversation, they want to connect with you directly, what would be the best way for them to do that?
Yeah, the best way to reach me would be through LinkedIn. So I've definitely got a visible profile there. I think it's the same picture from the article in there. So I only take about one good picture a year. So that has to be it. So I'm on there, and that'd be the best way to reach me. And Philip, I thank you for all that you do for the procurement community. I do very much enjoy listening to your podcasts. And I think you do a great job of painting this community in a very positive light. And you bring attention to a sector that I feel like sometimes doesn't get the attention it deserves. So I applaud you for the effort, and I thank you very much for your time today.
Well, thank you so much, Andy. I'm never that good at taking credit or taking any positive comments, but I just thank you for those, because that's what we're trying to do here at Art of Procurement, is really just to elevate our role, elevate our impact collectively as a community, and then hopefully that changes how we are perceived and positioned outside of procurement. And it starts here. We can't expect anybody to think about procurement in a different light if we're not exhibiting the qualities that we want them to see. And Andy, one last time, I just want to thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you, Philip. Appreciate it.
Thanks. Hi there. I want to thank you for tuning in to today's podcast. You can check out all of our back catalogue at artofprocurement.com/podcast, where you can also subscribe to our newsletter to make sure that you never miss an episode. And if you found value in today's show, I'd love if you would tell a peer, or perhaps go and rate and review by going to artofprocurement.com/review. Word of mouth really is the best way to help the podcast grow, and if you're able to do either one of those things, I would truly appreciate it.